In Walt's books, you have Killer Weekend, Killer View, Killer Summer, and In Harm's Way had a working title of Killer Silence.
It did.
What made you go off?
My publisher. Publishers have a way with titles. Now, there were two things. One is that Bolt walked on in this book, and so I realized it wasn't purely a Walt book. So I was very agreeable when the publisher, who had originally asked me to find some word theme for this series, which always makes me feel like I'm pressing out canned tuna or something, but I was more than happy to get away from that when they said, maybe we should do one without. And I said, well, this has a lot of Bolt in it, so I'd love to do one without. And so it's In Harm's Way.
With both series, you write from the third person perspective.
Yeah, I do.
But you worked on a book called The Diary of Ellen Rimbauer.
I did.
And you had to take on a different perspective in that one, since it's a diary format, and it's also female. How is that?
It was a wild project. I was, because I'm in this band with Stephen King, I was approached by my publisher, who was a division of Disney, Hyperion books for adults. And they said, hey, look, we know about this, we know about a movie of the week that Steve King is writing for ABC. It's very cloak and dagger. Nobody knows about it. But we wondered if there isn't a book that we could have written as a tie-in to Stephen King's Rose Red, which was going to be a miniseries on ABC. Very big deal. And they said, would you be interested in that? And I said, look, if Steve was interested in that, I would be interested in that. But I am not going to hold on to Steve King's shirt tail here. I mean, this is only if it's something he wants. And they said, well, actually, we've already talked to his business people. They would agree to it if you would do it. Steven said, if Ridley does it, I would do this. And I said, well, you know, I'd be happy to do that. What do you have in mind? And they said, we'd like to do an architectural coffee table book about the building that's in Rose Red. And I said, well, you've got the wrong guy. That had absolutely no interest to me. So they said, well, what would you want to do? And I said, you know, I'm a researcher. Why don't you send me the script? And I'll read the script and tell you if I think there's some kind of prequel in the book somewhere. And so I literally had to, I signed a non-disclosure that I think would have cost the lives of my first two kids. It was about 85 pages long, and it basically said that if I disclosed anything of those screenplays of Rose Red, they were going to take every bank account I had, all my homes, all of everything. But I signed this thing, and I got to read, I think it was about 600 pages of screenplay that were these 4 or 5 nights of Rose Red. And several times throughout the script, the characters would refer to Ellen's diary. This is a haunted house owned by Ellen and John Rimbauer. And they referred to a diary that Ellen had written in her youth. And, you know, it didn't take me long to realize that the book that had to be read was Ellen's diary, the diary of Ellen Rimbauer. So I proposed this to my publisher, and then they had to read the script. And they said, well, that would be fine, but you're talking about a 19-year-old woman in 1906 Seattle. And I said, yeah. And they said, so you'd have to write the diary in the point of view of a 19-year-old woman. I said, yeah. And they said, are you willing to do that? I said, yeah. And they asked Steve, and Steve called up, Ridley, you know, is this something you really want to do? And I went, yeah. And so I wrote it. And it was one of the most fun projects I've ever undertaken. I loved writing in the point of view of a 19-year-old woman. I loved being in 1906 Seattle. I had written a lot about Seattle. I hadn't studied its history much. And I had to study a lot of history to understand the setting and place that this young woman was coming into. And it was just a total blast. And Steve and I, about halfway through, we talked about it. We decided it wouldn't be published with my name on it or his name. That if we did this, a movie had come out called Blair Witch. Blair Witch Project, I think. And it was a very grassroots, viral kind of success. And Steve said, Ridley, why don't we just turn this loose to the gods? If it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. So we took my name off it. We took his name off it. It was published as a found diary that had been discovered in Maine and had been what Steve King had based Rose Red off of. And it got going on the internet that this thing had been found and was being published. And it became a #1 New York Times bestseller. Published as discovered by Dr. Joyce Reardon, The Diary of Ellen Rimbauer. And I was Joyce Reardon, I was Stephen Reardon, I was Ellen Rimbauer, I was all these people, and I was under contract not to ever divulge that until it was decided we could reveal it. So all this viral stuff got going on the internet that Steve King had written it, which is why it sold billions of copies. And of course, people called me as members of the band, do you know who wrote it? Nope, don't have a clue, you know. And so it's the only adult side #1 New York Times bestseller I've ever had, and I've never been credited for it. The only other New York Times #1 I had was on the kids' side, so it's, you know, it's kind of frustrating, but it was a lot of fun.
Okay, I have to ask one more question, and then we'll see if we have some time to throw it out to you. You, not too long ago, went and taught in China.
I did. I went and taught creative writing in English to juniors at Fudan University, which is sort of the MIT or the Harvard of China, in their College of International Language and Literature. I taught for a year, so I taught 2 different semesters, 30 students each, mostly women. And as I say, I taught in English and they wrote in English. It was one of the most fascinating years of my life. They had never written a creative word in their lives. And I had to gear them up over this 17-week course to not only write creatively, but be able to write, you know, a successful short story. I learned much more than they did through this process, but it was just an absolute amazing time for me. I taught using Harry Potter, and I taught using To Kill a Mockingbird, which is my favorite book in the English language, and I reread it every year. And so I taught using those 2 books. To Kill a Mockingbird had not been brought over to China at that point that I know of. I couldn't find it, so I brought it over from Amazon. And now it's been allowed in and is being sold in China in huge numbers. So it's been a really fun thing for me to sort of introduce her book over there. You couldn't find it over there, and you know, it's been a real fun thing to be part of.
And you heard from Harper Lee because of that, didn't you?
Well, I did. I heard. Not from Harper Lee. It turned out that a very good friend of mine knew Nell, as she's referred to, which I did not know. And this friend came up and said, you know, I grew up next door to Harper Lee and would love to tell her about you teaching in China. And I think she would really love to hear from your Chinese students. And I went, oh my gosh, I mean, to me Harper Lee is, you know, God. So I was just floored. So I wrote my students, this was several months after I'd finished and come back to the States. And I wrote my students and said, Harper Lee would like to hear from you about what you thought about her book. And many of them wrote back to me. And I compiled all these emails and got them to her. I never did hear from her, but I hope she got as big a kick out of it as I did.
Okay, I told Ridley yesterday that we could talk all day because he's so fascinating, but before they kick us off the stage, let's see if we can get 1 or 2 questions in. Anybody have any?
This is where Dave Barry says, problems with your medication, problems at home.